Plumber discovered a large amount of money hidden in a wall at Lakewood Church there. Police say evidence from the checks suggests the discovery was connected to a March 2014 theft.
For years, Lakewood Church looked untouchable. Every week, thousands packed into a former NBA arena to hear Joel Osteen's message of hope, positivity, and prosperity. The crowds were massive, the ministry was thriving, and many believed the megachurch model would continue growing forever. But something changed. Today, entire sections of Lakewood's massive auditorium sit empty. Attendance has fallen dramatically. Longtime members have quietly left, and critics say the warning signs were there all along. Was this decline caused by the pandemic, financial controversies, or something much deeper? The answer reveals a story that stretches back decades and may redefine the future of American Christianity. The trust crisis. As attendance declined across many of America's largest churches, another and perhaps even more serious problem began to emerge. The issue was no longer simply about empty seats or shrinking congregations. It was about trust. Across the country, public confidence in major religious institutions started to erode. Stories involving financial controversies, leadership failures, lavish lifestyles, and concerns about accountability dominated headlines. Even churches that had never been directly connected to a scandal found themselves dealing with growing skepticism from members and outsiders alike. For decades, many churchgoers had accepted the success of large ministries as evidence that they were making a positive impact. But as public conversations changed, people began asking questions they had previously overlooked. Where exactly did millions of dollars in donations go? Who was responsible for overseeing church finances? Who held influential pastors accountable when concerns arose? Why did some ministries appear to operate more like large corporations than spiritual communities? These questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. Joel Osteen found himself at the center of many of these discussions, not because he was involved in every controversy being discussed, but because Lakewood Church had become one of the most recognizable symbols of the megachurch movement. To supporters, Osteen represented optimism, encouragement, and a message of hope. To critics, however, Lakewood represented many of the concerns people had about modern religious institutions. The church's enormous size, sophisticated production, and global reach made it an easy target for those questioning the direction of contemporary Christianity. At the same time, attitudes toward prosperity theology were beginning to shift. During periods of economic uncertainty and financial hardship, some people found it increasingly difficult to relate to messages centered on success, abundance, and personal blessing. Critics argued that such teachings often seemed disconnected from the realities many families were facing. Rising living costs, job insecurity, and economic struggles led some to question whether messages about prosperity truly reflected their everyday experiences. The atmosphere inside many megachurches also became a topic of discussion. Massive auditoriums, elaborate stage productions, giant video screens, and highly polished presentations had once been viewed as exciting innovations. But for some people, those same features began creating a sense of distance rather than connection. The larger the churches became, the harder it was for many attendees to feel personally known or involved. Former members started sharing their experiences publicly. Some described feeling less like participants and more like spectators watching a performance. Others said they struggled to form meaningful relationships within congregations that numbered in the tens of thousands. While they appreciated the quality of the services, they often felt disconnected from the deeper sense of community they had originally hoped to find. As these concerns spread, the conversation gradually shifted. People were no longer debating whether megachurches were successful. Instead, they were asking whether the model itself was sustainable over the long term. Could churches continue relying on massive crowds, large budgets, and highly produced services in a culture increasingly seeking authenticity and personal connection. Could institutions built around growth maintain the trust of younger generations who often valued transparency and community over size and spectacle? These questions created a challenge that attendance numbers alone could not explain. A church can recover from a temporary decline in membership. It can launch new programs, renovate facilities, or expand its outreach efforts. Rebuilding trust, however, is far more difficult. Once people begin questioning the integrity, priorities, or purpose of an institution, restoring confidence can take years. That is why the decline of many megachurches became about more than statistics. It reflected a deeper shift in how people viewed faith, leadership, and religious organizations. The real challenge facing churches like Lakewood was no longer filling seats. It was convincing people that the institution still deserved their trust. And once trust begins to disappear, rebuilding it can be one of the most difficult tasks any organization will ever face. When Lakewood ruled America, there was a time when Lakewood Church represented the very definition of religious success in America. To many observers, it wasn't just a church, it was a phenomenon. Every Sunday felt less like a traditional worship service and more like a major event that drew people from across the country and around the world. Long before the service even began, parking lots filled with vehicles, traffic stretched for blocks, and volunteers worked tirelessly to direct the flow of thousands of attendees. Families arrived early, eager to secure their seats in what had once been the home arena of the Houston Rockets. The atmosphere was electric. The excitement was contagious. For many first-time visitors, the sheer scale of the experience was unlike anything they had ever seen inside a church. At the center of it all stood Joel Osteen, a pastor whose influence extended far beyond the walls of Lakewood. Unlike many traditional religious leaders, Osteen became a mainstream cultural figure. His warm smile, positive outlook, and encouraging messages helped him build an audience that reached millions. His books regularly appeared on bestseller lists, his television broadcasts aired across the globe, and his sermons attracted viewers who might never have considered attending a church service otherwise. He offered a message centered on hope, personal growth, and the belief that better days were always ahead. For many people, that message arrived at exactly the right moment. Individuals facing financial hardship, family struggles, health concerns, or personal setbacks often found comfort in Osteen's optimistic approach. Rather than focusing heavily on judgment or controversy, he emphasized possibility, purpose, and perseverance. As a result, Lakewood continued growing at an extraordinary pace. As attendance surged, Lakewood became the most visible symbol of a larger movement sweeping through American Christianity. Megachurches were expanding across the nation. Congregations that once numbered in the hundreds now attracted thousands. New campuses opened, budgets increased, production quality improved dramatically. Worship services incorporated concert-level sound systems, giant video screens, sophisticated lighting, and professional-quality music. The traditional image of church was evolving, and Lakewood stood at the forefront of that transformation. Everything appeared to be moving in one direction, upward. Attendance climbed year after year. Donations increased. Media reach expanded. More churches attempted to replicate the formula that seemed to be working so well. Church growth conferences promoted similar strategies, and leaders across the country studied Lakewood's success. To many observers, the megachurch model seemed unstoppable. It appeared to have discovered the perfect combination of faith, media, technology, and mass appeal. Yet beneath the surface, subtle warning signs were beginning to emerge. While leaders celebrated record attendance and impressive growth statistics, few paused to consider a more important question. Did bigger necessarily mean stronger? Large crowds certainly created the appearance of success, but attendance numbers alone could not measure the depth of spiritual engagement, personal connection, or long-term commitment among members. As churches grew larger, maintaining meaningful relationships became increasingly difficult. Some attendees loved the excitement and energy, while others quietly struggled to find a sense of belonging within such massive congregations. The very factors that fueled growth, size, scale, and production, sometimes made personal connection harder to achieve. At the time, these concerns were easy to overlook because the success seemed overwhelming. The crowds kept coming, the services remained packed, and the momentum appeared unstoppable. Few people imagined that the very strengths that helped build the megachurch movement might eventually become its greatest vulnerabilities. Years later, as attendance patterns shifted and cultural attitudes changed, those early questions would return with surprising force. The issue was no longer whether Lakewood had achieved extraordinary success. The real question was whether a model built on constant growth could survive when that growth finally began to slow. The answer would eventually reshape not only Lakewood Church, but the future of the megachurch movement itself. The warning. No one took seriously. The first major warning sign appeared long before Lakewood Church or other megachurches began experiencing declining attendance. In fact, the alarm was sounded more than a decade before empty seats became a common sight. In 2007, one of the most influential churches in America released a report that sent shockwaves through religious circles. While the findings did not immediately make national headlines, many church leaders who read the study recognized its significance. It challenged one of the core assumptions driving the rapid growth of the megachurch movement and raised questions that few leaders were prepared to answer. The report became known as the Reveal Study, and it was conducted by Willow Creek Community Church, one of the pioneers and most respected leaders of the megachurch movement. At the time, Willow Creek was widely viewed as a model of church growth and innovation. Churches across the country studied its methods, attended its leadership conferences, and attempted to replicate its success. That is what made the findings so surprising. Researchers examined the spiritual development of church members and discovered something unexpected. The people who had attended for the longest periods were not necessarily becoming more spiritually mature or deeply connected to their faith. In some cases, longtime attendees reported feeling stagnant in their spiritual growth. The assumption had always been that greater participation naturally led to stronger faith. The study suggested that reality might be far more complicated. The findings stunned many church leaders. For years, attendance numbers had been used as one of the primary measurements of success. If more people were showing up every Sunday, then churches assumed they were effectively fulfilling their mission. But the Reveal study introduced a troubling possibility. What if churches were becoming increasingly effective at attracting people while becoming less effective at helping them grow spiritually? Even leaders involved in the study openly acknowledged the concerns. Some admitted that churches had become highly skilled at creating programs, events, and experiences that drew crowds. However, they were not always succeeding in helping people develop lasting spiritual depth. The report challenged leaders to reconsider whether growth statistics alone were enough to measure success. Despite the warning, most megachurches continued expanding at a rapid pace. Attendance remained strong. Donations continued flowing. New campuses opened in cities across America. Larger buildings were constructed. More sophisticated technology was installed. Worship services became increasingly polished and professional. From the outside, everything appeared to be working perfectly. For many church leaders, there seemed little reason to change course. The numbers looked impressive, and growth remained the primary focus. As long as auditoriums stayed full and budgets remained healthy, the concerns raised by the Reveal study were often pushed aside. After all, why question a system that appeared to be producing such remarkable results? Yet critics argued that something important was being overlooked. They believed many megachurches had become increasingly focused on creating memorable experiences rather than building deep spiritual communities. Worship services were becoming larger, more polished, and more entertaining. Massive stages, professional quality music, and high-end production created powerful experiences for attendees. But some members quietly reported feeling disconnected despite being surrounded by thousands of people. For these individuals, the problem was not the quality of the services, it was the lack of meaningful connection. They often felt anonymous in enormous congregations where personal relationships could be difficult to develop. While churches excelled at attracting crowds, they sometimes struggled to create the sense of community that many people were seeking. Looking back, the Reveal study appears remarkably prophetic. It identified weaknesses in the megachurch model years before those weaknesses became impossible to ignore. Few people realized that the foundation supporting the megachurch boom might be more fragile than it seemed. The crowds were still enormous, the budgets were still growing, and the future looked bright. But beneath the success, cracks were already forming. The storm that would eventually expose those weaknesses had not yet arrived. When it finally did, many churches discovered that impressive growth statistics could not guarantee long-term stability. The warning had been there all along. The problem was that almost no one wanted to listen. The pandemic that changed everything. In March 2020, the world changed almost overnight. Businesses closed, public gatherings disappeared, and millions of people were suddenly confined to their homes. Churches across America faced a situation unlike anything they had experienced before. Sanctuaries that had been filled with worshipers every week suddenly stood empty. For Lakewood Church, one of the largest congregations in the country, the change was especially striking. The massive former Houston Rockets arena that had once hosted thousands of attendees each Sunday sat completely silent. At first, church leaders believed the disruption would be temporary. Services quickly moved online, and live streams became the primary way churches stayed connected with their members. Pastors reassured congregations that normal gatherings would soon return. The expectation was simple. Once restrictions ended, people would come back, and everything would continue as before. But that is not what happened. As months passed, churches across the country began noticing an alarming trend. Attendance numbers failed to recover. Some congregations lost a third of their members. Others lost nearly half. Smaller churches struggled financially, and some were forced to close permanently. Even churches that had once seemed untouchable found themselves facing unexpected challenges. At Lakewood, online engagement remained impressive. Millions continued watching sermons and consuming digital content. Yet, the reality inside the building told a different story. Physical attendance declined significantly. Entire sections of the arena remained empty. Volunteer teams became smaller. The excitement and energy that had once defined the church were noticeably different. What made the situation particularly surprising was that the pandemic itself was not necessarily the root cause of the decline. Instead, it exposed weaknesses that had existed beneath the surface for years. During long months at home, many people had time to reflect on their relationship with faith, church, and community. Some realized they did not miss the large productions, crowded auditoriums, and stadium-style services as much as they had expected. Without the excitement of packed crowds, powerful music, and a high-energy atmosphere, people began asking deeper questions about what truly mattered in their spiritual lives. They started evaluating whether faith depended on attending a massive event every week, or whether it could exist outside those walls. For megachurches, built around momentum, attendance, and large-scale gatherings, this shift proved devastating. The very features that had fueled years of growth suddenly seemed less important to many former attendees. People who once filled enormous auditoriums began seeking different experiences, while others stepped away altogether. The result was a transformation few church leaders had anticipated. What began as a temporary interruption evolved into a permanent change in how many Americans viewed church. The pandemic did not create the challenges facing megachurches. It simply revealed them. And once those weaknesses became visible, it was impossible to ignore them. The end of the megachurch era? By 2023, the numbers painted a troubling picture for megachurches across America. Congregations that once attracted tens of thousands of worshipers every week were reporting significant attendance declines. Some churches closed satellite campuses, while others reduced staff, cut expenses, and downsized operations in an effort to remain sustainable. What had once appeared to be an unstoppable movement was now facing serious challenges. One of the most noticeable shifts came from younger generations. Increasingly, younger believers were moving away from traditional megachurch environments and searching for something different. Many were looking for smaller communities where relationships felt more personal and authentic. Rather than sitting among thousands of strangers each week, they wanted opportunities to build meaningful connections and engage in deeper conversations about faith. Many also desired a different approach to spiritual growth. Instead of one-way presentations delivered from massive stages, they wanted discussions that allowed questions, doubts, and real-life struggles to be explored openly. For them, faith was not simply about attending an event, but about participating in a community that felt genuine and supportive. As a result, alternative forms of worship began gaining momentum. House churches, neighborhood gatherings, small group ministries, and intimate congregations started attracting former megachurch attendees. Many of these individuals insisted they had not abandoned Christianity or lost their faith. Rather, they had become disillusioned with a model that often seemed focused on attendance numbers, production quality, and constant expansion. Meanwhile, megachurches attempted to adapt to changing realities. Some expanded their digital ministries, invested heavily in online content, and sought to reach audiences through live streams and social media. Others restructured operations and reduced expenses to match declining attendance. Yet, despite these efforts, the broader trend remained difficult to ignore. The era of rapid megachurch growth appeared to be slowing dramatically. American Christianity was entering a period of transformation, and the future looked very different from the past. The question was no longer whether change was happening. The real question was, what would emerge to replace the model that had dominated religious life for decades? Today, the lights still shine at Lakewood Church. Joel Osteen continues preaching to thousands, and the ministry remains one of the most recognizable religious organizations in the world. But the atmosphere is different. The crowds are smaller, the momentum has slowed, and questions about the future continue to grow. Whether Lakewood's decline represents a temporary setback or the beginning of a larger transformation remains to be seen. What is clear is that the megachurch model that once dominated American Christianity is facing challenges unlike anything it has encountered before. As believers search for deeper connections, greater authenticity, and new ways to practice their faith, the future of the church may look very different from its past. What do you think is really happening at Lakewood Church? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more revealing stories and in-depth investigations.